Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval siege warfare. Surprisingly, on Schwerpunkt we never covered so much about this topic for a number of reasons. There are both sort of exogenous and endogenous. It's even more sort of unbelievable from my perspective, given that I actually wrote hundreds of pages on siege warfare, also to a degree of depth that I haven't found in any other work so far. In fact, studying every single siege that I could find in my, say, regional timeline of a couple of generations, treated by my doctoral thesis. That, in fact, this is not about bragging more than much about what I do, but definitely explaining how different it is from most research. Normally, like siege warfare is approached mostly from a sort of overarching conceptual point of view, or even a just very material one. We looked at siege warfare also from a theoretical point of view in the Kriege, which is also actually the most important part of the story if one wants to understand the logic of siege warfare and, of course, of a campaign in general, because siege warfare, as you understand, is always there and quite intensely so. So there is, from one side, the notion that the Middle Ages were about a few, if anything, pitched battles, and mostly about lots of sieges. But if you actually look at it, this may come maybe not as a shocker, but it's something that, at least you would be surprised by how nobody really ever told you that there were so many different open field engagements that, however, simply not much the history of the time, sometimes that is the case, especially for the ancient world, giving that optical distortion, in fact, as a consequence, were not recorded by modern historiography, and that they actually happen all the time. They were even more frequent than sieges. Also, what's a siege? Because, you can't count into that also some sort of small combat along, like into a fortification of any sort. Even, I don't know, storming a house can become a siege to some extent. And so there is, first of all, some confusion about what this is. But also this general bias for which medieval warfare would have just revolved around sieges per se, right? And not being as any other era in history where siege warfare exists. And of course, there would be some preconditions for making it somehow more frequent, but not necessarily more relevant in the way we intend, like the absolute strategic quantity. In fact, most of the battles were the consequence of a siege. Notoriously, somebody sieges a center, which is exactly like a bait, or sometimes it is properly a strategic objective in a majoritory sense, and then somebody comes to break off the siege, and these two forces that are importantly concentrated for that task will escalate into a major clash in open field, as a matter of fact. We have already seen many of them. In this sense, like, you could easily understand how medieval warfare is not really subordinated to siege warfare in this, because this other engagements that mostly we remember because of the pitched battle, and those rare pitched battles that actually weren't rare at all, were actually overshadowing their siege that we also don't care about more than much, right? So this video wants to be a military history of some sort and a general introduction, just to talk more about medieval siege warfare, castles, like military engineering in general. But it must also make a premise, at least, about the political and social preconditions that eventually made also historiography see the Middle Ages mostly about siege warfare and not much the overwhelmingly advanced and sophisticated art of war existing at the time, including in siege warfare, because that's not a sort of dysfunctional way of war at all, right? And there is an incredible complexity in the technicality, in the precision, also in the homogenization, like in the tempo. What really amazes you is how homogeneous all the modus operandi really was in all this, like how all armies fundamentally perform in the same identical way, because they were so habituated to to fight. Like we're not talking just siege warfare, but at the time, like we documented really many sort of militarized contexts that you can extend to a degree to the entire medieval scenario, whereby you never find like a people that does not know how to make war or is unprepared, or doing something particularly stupid or incompetent. No, like we have such a clear level of homogeneity in the general capacity, in the willingness to perform this gigantic effort at times, especially like against fortresses. And as we'll see now, there are ways to explain this, but of course it does get down to political fragmentation and also scarcity of technical means of some sort that are also very much interdependent. I mean, especially because of the subordination of the latter to the former. However, that does, even when these conditions change, again, siege warfare in the art of war does not really sort of fade. On the contrary, in some cases, it becomes also sort of even more relevant, right? But we will see this better also through other videos, because it's such a big topic. It must be dealt with conceptually to mostly get what it really is. Today we just tell this military story rather than history, to clarify this picture, right? So in explaining why in many cases, of course, the commanders of the time were to deal with this obsidianal art as a mandatory part of their curriculum. There is also this historiographical bias would mostly come to the Middle Ages, right? I realize, for example, that my fortune as a channel is also depending on this prejudice, meaning that I really see that people do not care about history in general. They do, if anything, they do not understand even what it's supposed to be. They think that when you look at history, you just are looking at themes that you think you somehow relate with for some pretty abstract and fantasy-like reason, and then the entire point of understanding, like the historical objective relevance of a given event or dynamic, is completely absent, properly from the intellectual horizons of the average person, and there is hardly anything you can do about this. And the Middle Ages, if anything, have been simplified, like dumbed down for many reasons. First of all, this apparent hyper-complexity due to the fact that there were so many different actors at a time, and you enter that in the equation, and immediately people will lose completely, even more, like any kind of the sense of the scale of comparative political, military, or social relevance. It's going to be just wishful thinking. Even more so if you have a sort of ragamuffin idea of the Middle Ages as a sort of dark age, or a moment where things did not work right for some reason. And even notable military historians, in a time that now makes them ridiculous, and this happened mostly in the 20th century, generally regarded the practice of warfare in the Middle Ages unfavorably. There were reasons for that. They weren't dumber people than the ones that write today, telling you the truth, and considered that in fact historiography had yet to literally develop to acknowledge and found particular ideas that, if anything, are instead as largely forgotten today. Now, these authors criticize the tendency of military forces to avoid open field confrontations, instead opting for lengthy sieges of urban centers and fortifications. The tactics employed during this era have thus often been viewed as a significant regression, involution, compared to the strategies of, say, early imperial Rome, exemplifying a marked deviation from a sophisticated military tradition that would not see partial resurgence until the Renaissance. And telling the truth, like when you look at medieval civilization at large, you realize that its peak is already arguably beyond classical antiquity, right? At least there is no doubt about this. You can debate by which scale, right? More or less they were similar, but there were some things about medieval civilization were far beyond classical antiquity. And in general, this is not my bias as a medievalist. I love classical antiquity, but the sense that, and we've seen it also from a traditional theological point of view, that had been a classical canon, in fact, that had been broken also in the way mankind dealt with the reality and the fragmentation of the ecumenic empire, the incapacity of the successors fundamentally to come back together in that Catholic sense, is there, right? And a part of the Middle Ages, the first part mostly, is definitely a shortcoming compared to antiquity in many ways. Not in all ways, or at least in ways that were constitutively or essentially inferior to the previous times. Actually, the ancient and medieval warfare are very similar. Like, we made literally thousands of videos about these topics, and it's very easy to see in a diachronic and comparative way how pretty much the same, like most issues dealt with by commanders, armies, and campaigns really were across the two eras. So what these historians in the 20th century, or also before, were mostly recriminating about was the sense that, from one side, like movement warfare, this is especially post-Napoleonic legacy, mostly in the 19th century, and of course even more with the 20th century, this greater punching capacity, the Bewegungskrieg, the armored warfare, even air force and so on, like render things so dynamic that made sort of the Middle Ages look like the dumber brother that sort of was not able to accomplish anything. But of course, this is a typically technologistic and positivistic invention that lesser people, namely modern people, make up to essentially distract themselves from the fact that, of course, they're not nor more intelligent nor more capable than people living 1,000 years ago, but that in fact in those specific conditions, just like today's, unless they're rigidly framed within a solid hierarchy and authority and discipline and training, they wouldn't have the palest idea of how to fight a war, let alone even understanding what war is, right? This applies to pretty much everybody, like including people who actually fight in wars, and that often do not have, unless they're very high in rank and have actually as extensive strategic experience, do not really realize, right? We live in a disconnected world in which, again, the average person is not properly meant to have a function that can help him encompass the entire world. Like, properly, we do not even need these people at large, at least with considering the current situation, just to do so, right? It would be enough for them to be dignified human being with an average schooling, but that seems to be too much, definitely, even in that regard. But in this regard, the sense that medieval warfare would be relatively mundane from a military standpoint, dominated by a monotonous focus on seizing cities and castles, is some sort of preconception and hard-to-die myth that is still incredibly rooted, like in pop culture, in this even among people of certain level of education or even historical competence. And unfortunately, this derives mostly from at large a complete lack of strategic education, because they do not understand essentially what they were doing at the time, right? They just compare apples to oranges, not just across the eras, but literally in terms of actual, mostly material technological issues, and they don't even see how much of a deal certain things were. It's like when you go, for example, if you visit Rome, if you walk along the Imperial Fora, of course you're mostly admiring the great marbles of antiquity, but there are, just not to say that you're hallucinating, two massive, but I mean massive, by far bigger than any other sort of ancient building. They're like bases, even not just the entirety of medieval towers from the 13th, from the 14th century. People pass by those and do not even, literally, you walk along the, one is the famous militia towers, the one close to the hospitalier St. John's house. The other is ahead, like closer to the Colosseum, but they're really like they're huge. Like they even just from a single point of view, like they perfectly exemplify the inherent superiority and power and beauty and I don't know, real racial primacy of what medieval civilization actually was. But again, people do not even know what they are. They don't even pose themselves the question of what it is. And we actually know what it is, because, say, medieval Rome was all a castle, right? People are obsessed with single castles in countryside, like the entire city were hundreds of castles. I don't know how to stress that, right? And this mere picture, even in for a city like Rome that we often digress on, perfectly tells you how, if literally you don't have even the idea that this was a thing, like you're completely severed from reality, from the world, from history, from any kind of culture, conventionally definable. And this is true also for those who should have actually dealt with this history. I mean, if you don't have historical education, well, okay. But there are people who had and still got this wrong. This is, again, from a PhD. Never foolishly pretend that just because a person is a PhD, they're right. But also do not make the even more stupid mistake of thinking that, having a PhD doesn't make any difference, right? Which is also what the average person would like to pretend. Now, the aforementioned historians had, unfortunately, a profound impact on later scholarship and public perceptions, as we just observed. So it's important to contextualize their opinion historically. In fact, they were writing, as were pointed out before, in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, a time when prolonged sieges were regarded as misallocation of time and resources, a serious blunder only an inexperienced commander would make. We really made lots of videos about Napoleonic warfare, from the Kriege to the actual more strictly also strategical. We talk about sieges, even in Napoleonic era, at least in the Age of Enlightenment. Napoleon, we talk about his contributions to the art of war, had established the belief that victory could only be achieved through grand, decisive battles guided by military ingenuity and strategic movement. Of course, this was the product of the nation-state of mass society that in the Middle Ages did not exist, but not only, that could have not existed even later hadn't the Middle Ages existed. They're just 300 years away from that. It's not like Europe was changing in such an overwhelming way, in a strictly technical sense. We're not that far from the Middle Ages, remember that. As we said before, even the notion that sieges were the dominant warfare method in the Middle Ages is a cliche, right? They were important, they were constitutively relevant, they were in many ways reaching their peak, like in the art of war, from certain specific points of view, certain indicators. But any of the reasons that brought them at the center of medieval warfare were not a result of a lack of strategy, nor of courage, even less. Early feudal Europe, so we talk about the high Middle Ages between, say, the 9th to the 12th centuries, was characterized by, compared to other eras, and it depends on where and when, in particular, even within the same period and compared to Rome, right, where, say, population density was relatively scarce, especially in the later period, like there were ever more frequent and deadly plagues that, however, were actually occurring the moment of demographic revival, which is also interesting. This shows you how everything is not obvious at all. In fact, the 12th century is a moment of decisive stepping further in terms of military engineering, siege warfare, stone castles, ever more, systemically erected, especially in places like England and France that had more resources, were more state-like, and could make an ever bigger strategic use of these particular fortresses. But in general, like, of course, if you compare this to the Middle Ages, to the industrial era, you can understand how economic activity was limited, many social estates remaining at a subsistence level, which means that the same military, say the same resources devolved to the military, were limited in absolute terms. They weren't really in relative terms, because the pressure put by these conditions would actually contribute even to this level of hyper-fortification. I have new videos incoming, in fact, on this aspect, that, again, it's as if an entire part of the Middle Ages, in terms of military development, had been hidden from you. Meaning the extent of fortification in the Middle Ages. Like, again, I love Rome, I love ancient Greece, and all the sort of amazing civilizations that managed to erect some of the greatest buildings and fortresses and whatever. And it's fine to celebrate them, but the question is that, like, this happened in the Middle Ages as well. It's not like it happened because of a castle or two. It happened in a systematic sense, in a way that we can't see today, because most of that is gone, because they were useless at a certain point down the line. They were demolished, destroyed. But that where they are in such a structured fashion, nobody ever showed you, right? We shouldn't be just impressed by, I don't know, the single castle that everybody knows, like Chateau Gaillard, for example, or, you know, and these are big names because of famous historical figures or whatever, but I'm talking literally about the fact that even a few hundred square kilometers were dotted with hundreds of fortresses. So the ones, in fact, you can't see today, but that were all used constantly, not every once in a while. This is also another thing about the Middle Ages. If you insist too much on the concept that there were not many resources, first of all, you can't even say this about even most of the Middle Ages. Like, again, the 13th, the 14th century, something bulimic in actual wealth, like way more than what had been experienced in antiquity. So why do we talk about the Middle Ages in the opposite way? But great part of those resources were in fact invested in warfare continuously. So it wasn't like they erected a castle and there was just a siege every, 20 years. But that may have even been the case in very central places, even in Europe. But let's say these other hundreds of fortifications were all one with this. I mean, they had a specific function to, in part, to discourage, to deter, but in many ways also to offend actually from the same fortifications. In fact, what you realize is that if this kind of medieval siege warfare would have simply been the proof of some sort of sclerotized and involved system, like, the entire warfare would have frozen. Like, there would have not been campaigns, there would have not been battles, everything would have stopped to that. Instead, no. Like, we see actually that the more fortresses there are, the more war there is. The bigger armies, the more powerful means to actually storm these castles, because at the end of the day, also castles were meant overall to be taken over. Like, if you have a normal army, or regional in kind, that people somehow deny having even existed in the tens of thousands on a regular basis in the Middle Ages, easily up to 30,000, especially in the later Middle Ages. And especially in certain areas, this is true, but also the ones that you never hear about in medieval Europe, which is a problem historiographically. Like, what matters is the army. Yes, it could be used, in fact, to take over a city, a fortress of particular relevance, but in general, like, if you have such a strong concentration of forces, strategically wise, you don't reason much in terms of, okay, I will stop this with a castle. Like, you reason mostly in terms of, I will stop that with an army. Otherwise, this will take over any castle. So because castles weren't passive defenses to the death of whoever was there. Like, if the situation was changing politically, internationally, lots of castles, which without much of a problem practically. So we shouldn't give too much importance, at least in a staticistic and passivistic, almost defensivistic, biased fashion to medieval warfare as a whole. But going back to this almost beginning, right? Because there's never a beginning in fortification or in castellation. There are phases in which this is more intense, especially with the actually with the expansion of Europe, but the fragmentation of of power, which is also an interesting dynamic. The remnants of Roman roads formed the core of communication in Europe alongside major navigable rivers. This wasn't really too bad. So while there were sparse population centers acting as key hubs in a civilization striving for recovery and development, these were, well endowed with resources in order to resist significant attacks, and that, especially again with the means of the time that were essentially the same ones of the ancient world, did not make siege warfare easy at all. I mean, think about Masada, think about the great sieges in ancient history that do not seem to have posed less challenges to everybody involved compared to the Middle Ages. So the political fragmentation inherent in feudal society created instability, right? Which again is also a plus, right? It's not a type of instability in Europe, in Western Europe especially, that, for example, stifles the development of the communities. These communities are thriving in this instability. They are fighting like hell, as a matter of fact, and this is a moment of actual boom of Western civilization that is surpassing, by the way, the Arabs. The Byzantines made lots of videos about this, right? And this can be exemplified by the same conflict fueled by this relatively limited territorial control. So the fact that there actually were big powers on paper, on parchment, still largely at this time, but you had sort of neighbor, even just a few tens of kilometers away, could have an army on his own on a regular basis. So this, if anything, made things more interesting, like more stimulating, more challenging, and even productive, especially for the winners. There are lots of different places in Europe that we analyzed. We know that, in very fully feudal countries like northern France, for example, there is a certain type of war, certain type of military organization. If you look at the highly civilized and Europeanized communal Italy, you'll find another type of sort of ranges of sort of authority system. If anything, again, Western armies are very similar to one another. That doesn't make too much sense even to emphasize the differences. This is something I also stressed very much in some ad hoc videos, really explaining it. However, everything must be reconduced to the paradigm of reference. Like if we want to talk about how, if anything, people made war, we have to focus on single battles and single campaigns and single sieges, right? And the politics behind that. You have at this time issues, and especially like in the central, eastern, northern part of Europe, regarding law and order, like allowing, for example, bands of outlaws to thrive in vast uninhabited regions. There are, again, this is yet another part of Europe where things remain a bit more behind in certain ways, and it's also the degree, again, of modernization versus the one of tradition and how they compenetrate one another that makes warfare in a way rather than another. It's also actually a very international time, right? Especially Latin Germanic Europe at this point, like with the expansion essentially of Frankish Roman Europe, also over the Slavs, is really dictating the conditions here. But at the same time, there are interesting blends exactly between different nationalities that bring also to major warfare. So given this backdrop, building defensive structures was seen in many ways as the most sensible allocation of public resources for security. On the short, as in the medium and the long term, building walls and bastions became essential, often involving the entire population in labor and financial support. This is not like it hadn't been a need before. This was a need also during the migration era, but good luck finding resources during the migration era. And castellation is something very specific, like in this more permanent nature of fortifications. It starts essentially In 10th century, central Italy basically reaches northeastern Germany by the beginning of the 12th century. All this wide area, post-Carolingian Europe, dots itself in literally, like you can count it, tens of thousands of castles easily, with different distribution patterns, with different, again, construction materials, for example, because, again, the Mediterranean, post-Roman Europe in general was way more affluent than the rest, and there is a lot of continuity with local infrastructure. But the point was always the same, especially in the age of the second invasion, especially in the 10th century. It is seen really as not just the age of encapsulation, but one of the affirmation of a truly military class that we will know as the knights, the milites, quite recognizably self-legitimized across all the era. So you see encapsulation, yes, but also the development of heavy cavalry. So how is that, right? Heavy cavalry does not work in closed spaces. The militaries, of course, are a bit the stormtroopers in siege warfare as well, but they fight primarily on horseback in open field, right? So the myth, again, that the Middle Ages is this just siege warfare. How do you even just dialectically and logically, explain it with the affirmation of cavalry in the strongest fashion that also ever happened in any era, right? Think about this paradox. Middle Ages are the great moment of greater development of fortification, but also the greater development of the most mobile, punching, and far-ranging arm that is cavalry, right? So this actually tells us about an incredibly advanced, powerful, complex art of war that was really punching hard and doing so with incredibly effective means. So in this era, you need it in any case to protect also from foreign peoples like pirates, bandits. Secondly, you can argue against more organized and formidable military foes because these were also tending to be the same local ones, and so there were also more political solutions just to major military struggles. And in general, just the fact that there were so many fortifications everywhere would model the degree by which armies would operate. So it's not that they needed to think that before creating an army. Like, just warfare was coming to be in that way, just in a broader political and social sense. The construction of a city with strong walls or a well-fortified castle, of course, required many years. This was also a very attractive economical issue because you could have this open working places, bringing people in, living in these areas that were already fortified. If anything, they were expanding further fortifications that were, in fact, to be permanent enhancements, bolstering the economic and demographic development of the region and its communities. And consider also, comparatively to other eras, that what was built essentially between the 13th and the 14th century, well, Europe will not see until the 17th, like in a comparable scale, right? This is valid also for, say, Gothic cathedrals, same thing, right? We began to build them as this long-term investment in those centuries, and then major crisis at the end of the Middle Ages, we finished some of this in the 19th century, right? So in times that we think, oh my god, they were so advanced, already in the Renaissance they were so advanced, were they? I don't think, for example, the Renaissance armies were that bigger than the ones of 13th, 14th century. They actually weren't, and there is all this myth that people still keep believing that, again, there was this incredible enhancement of warfare in the Renaissance, that technically, if you look in absolute terms at the actual resources spent, I'm not talking about what could happen on the battlefield, the difference in the various arms, that's a bit of another story, that reflects also the political capacity, concentration, but in terms of sheer amount of resources, which really travel on two different tracks, early modern warfare was less intense than what had happened in first half of 14th century Europe. So additionally, in the Middle Ages, such defenses aligned with the ambitions of the feudal lords, empowering them in their ongoing struggles against central authority. And they weren't merely passive systems, right? They helped projecting offensives because you could simply act in this inner lines, within these inner lines, without really being obstacled, because if the enemy wanted to go at you, you would easily pin him down one of these castles. So actually, the more you build those in a advanced position, and the more you could project your power further, which is absolutely an offensive concept. The benefits of these fortifications were numerous. Defending them required a minimal number of armed individuals, thereby conserving the most limited and valuable source that was, at the time, manpower. Right. This is one of the most important aspects of encapsulation. Is very technical at this point, that even a handful of people can successfully hold out for a while against disproportionately larger sources. And of course, the entire military engineering of castles was conceived for this purpose. Again, these fortresses were not impregnable. First of all, because it would be physically impossible, but literally because they were not conceived for that. There were so many other fortresses that also acquire a greater or a smaller strategic value depending on the strategic circumstances that all in turn depend on the political ones. So this is also the beauty of warfare. Remember, the second element in the Clausewitzian trinity, that is the military associated with gamble. Right. Remember always that war, according to von Clausewitz, is a game, both objectively and subjectively. So there is this literally dice rolling phase in which you can see, like even just through basic the dimension of military history, how random sometimes the locations where major engagements would occur. And also, in fact, how the same goes for sieges. Like there are some fortresses that are not necessarily like the most impregnable, the biggest, the most important, but let's say they come to be strategically relevant and defended and backed up depending on the circumstance, on the campaign, on the forces involved, right? This is beautiful, really. It's exciting in war. So there would be so many that all the strategic picture would change on the basis of so many factors. You couldn't even predict which fortress would be more central than another, right? Even when we are starting to see very big strategic, like sort of regionally relevant, say cornerstones of defense, like as the major powers, especially from the 12th century, start building. But they're rare, right? And still there are many more fortresses all around that we don't remember that were making the strategic quantity by themselves. Fortresses would, of course, deter potential attackers, as mounting an assault necessitated considerable organizational effort and time, right? Which you may not exactly have. Resources, time, it all depends on the strategic circumstance. And the general sense was erecting strongholds that would often be beyond the reach of many, at least most, would-be aggressors. Like if you really consider warfare in that fragmented sense, where every lord can take on the initiative, or any city can be on its own, of course, you must create castles in a way, or at least just in quality and quantity, in distribution and location, that fits this general rule of the good enough that warfare is based on, right? It doesn't make any sense to predict certain issues. Of course, there are some major ways that are always going to be important, must be fortified. There are some, crossings. Those are the obvious places where you would fortify places, and that would also foster, for example, the development of cities. Think about, where the Romans themselves founded their cities, where the Celts had erected their oppida. That's something really continuing throughout the millennia, but it's not all, right? It's just the more likely and more important place. But if you realize how that politically bypassed that military obstacle can be most of the times, like you realize how fluid really politics and war really are. Medieval military architecture exhibited remarkable technical skill, to say the least, evident in the formidable city walls found in numerous Italian and European cities. I have, again, a video that is exactly about this never heard kind of topic, that is the massive, not just house towers in numbers like of the Italian communes, but probably their city walls, right? We're talking sometimes even 3 rings in addition to the Roman one. We're talking massive infrastructure that eventually was surclassed by, star forts in the Renaissance, whatever, so we hardly see any of them. But once Europe was that, right, in the richest areas, the most urbanized, these were enormous structures that have not been culturally celebrated for their greatness. And there are, right, remnants of this stuff to varying degrees in all the various centers. But of course, it's something different from what they looked like, and especially as a wall, right, as in a wholly systematic sense. Without also historical background, it's a bit difficult, even just with an archaeological one, to really understand the strategic relevance behind them. And of course, this is complemented by the vast array of castles and encampments constructed during this era. For example, medieval camps were pretty darn good, right? And again, everybody knows about Roman military camps and how sort of uniformed they were, how well drilled the Roman legionaries were in order to erect them in every situation, all the time, every night. But do we want to realize that the medievals had exactly the same thing? I mean, at least when we look at the heart of medieval civilization, and of course, because even smaller armies in the previous period would have had something that was at least satisfactory in that degree. So obviously, I don't know, it's just like artillery. You do not need, in the early Middle Ages, a sophisticated torsion catapult engine to besiege a moat. Right, you can take just by time. And also, in fact, the importance of artillery, both in antiquity and in the Middle Ages, regardless of the extraordinary technical feats and performances, are probably overrated. Right, it's not essentially just about these engines. I have technology, so I win war. No, it doesn't happen like that. Right, and first of all, you must understand that there are hundreds of these. All around. There is a hierarchy, there are the bigger ones, and alone, also, they do not really make the thing, right? It's a very strategic. I know that many people still reason in terms of post-Vietnam trauma, phobia of hand-to-hand fighting, but strategically speaking, it was mostly about that, right? If you don't send human waves at fortification, you don't storm them, right? Even if you keep trebucheting stuff against the walls, right? And this is also obvious in a physical sense. But again, people tend to fixate on deterministic, materialistic explanations, and just by that degree, they do not understand absolutely anything about warfare that is primarily a clash between moral forces. And especially, they require the physical annihilation of the enemy in interest of concentrated time, mostly. And you can't do that with artillery. You must do it by going out there and, especially in this point, like getting into hand-to-hand combat with masses of men butchering each other down. So naturally, in siege warfare, there is an important disproportion of at least a numerical disproportion, but it's not, in fact, an actual disproportion when you count the forces involved as they're multiplied in defense, for example, by the castle structure, etc. But this is sort of obvious, intuitive even. But again, there is all a technical medieval civilization. It's so advanced, it's so, again, compact, homogeneous, flowing, smooth, that, when you look at this, like, why don't we celebrate, medieval encampments? We just talk about ancient ones. They did exactly the same thing in terms of marches. I counted them many times. There were armies normally they made 30 kilometers in a day, which is exactly what they did in antiquity, and also exactly what they did in later times. And even reaching 60, 70 kilometers in a day. Well, these are forced marches that are insane, but it did happen, right? And so nobody really understands what was there about medieval warfare to be backwards, apparently. So such achievements reflect a deep reservoir of engineering, geological, scientific, architectural, ballistic expertise. We know that there were plenty of technicians out there. We know medieval science being particularly advanced. We know in the West, like, local scholars being aware of the existence of manuscripts in Arab, Byzantine libraries that were not used there, and that in the West we already knew what kind of content they contain, and they just used them to complement theoretically all the material practice that we had already developed, even surpassing those places. It's utterly insane that nobody points this enormous military culture, and demonstrating, by the way, how vicious this sense of a culture marked by crude ignorance, as we've been presented the Middle Ages like, is just the fruit of, I would say, a humanly inferior brain, right? I can't think of another reality to actually explain something so self-evident and macroscopically so. Now, the strategic use of fortifications by feudal lords is also clearly evident in a deeper sense. These were the men who really organized the local communities, who modified the landscape, who used the loot from the military expeditions for reinvesting in specialized crops. And they were, again, the guys in charge. A prime example that we have encountered in the video about the Count of Anjou is the one of Fulk III, right? The famous Fulk III, 970-1040, who fortified his holdings along the Loire Valley, so such a strategic riverway in France, by establishing around 100 castles in there. We are, again, between the 10th and 11th century. So, again, alone, this guy there, and again, it's northern France, still at this point, like, it's a bit of a colder place, like, it's very, very fertile, admittedly, but it's a cyclopic amount of energy, of work spent in order to erect them, right? And again, the guy was very rich, very powerful. He had such a beautiful strategic location on the lower Loire, surrounded by, again, pretty troublesome neighbors like the Bretons, the Normans, the Aquitanians, but also the King of France. And so there were lots of good reasons to fortify this way. Fulk did not do this merely for static defense, but aimed to create a secure base for his aggressive expansionistic strategies, because of course he was not less than his neighbors, on the contrary. And that's why the Counts of Anjou, by the way, were so successful. Fulk, along with his successors, had in fact to undertake forward-thinking political evaluations and meticulous territorial analysis, anticipating potential threats well ahead of time, as fortification projects demanded considerable time and resources, as we've seen, alongside methods that could not be hastily devised. So when you think about these men, their means, their culture, just ask yourself, of course, the purely rhetorical question of whether you're more intelligent or capable than them. Do you have any idea of how to calculate the strategic forces in order to articulate the defense of a regional scale territory? Seeing where the enemy kind of, like, first of all, it requires a superlative political culture, and secondly, there is all a technical vision. Like, these men knew, essentially, like, in a metaphysical sense. There is a beautiful passage from the Von Kriege that says that even just deterrence or threat from the enemy in itself, even when it does not materialize, it doesn't happen in any sense, is by itself a real, tangible, concrete strategic quantity, because it obliges you to take countermeasures that will also prevent him from enacting his own. And so you must be able to project, like, in time and in space. Imagine these guys, again, spending their literal life on horseback, riding over green, fat, wet French countryside, knowing every place, the skyline, the sort of the morphology of the terrain, the concentration of resources, which territory was more or less fertile, how many peasants worked there or not, all things that he would manage on a regular basis, and realizing what needed to be done with watchtowers, castles, like, especially depots. That was a very important thing. The faldrum, like how to feed the horses, where to expect it, a greater concentration of forces would have been needed. It was all meticulously arranged. Like this is yet another aspect of also the continuity, like in the territorial molding in medieval Europe through the millennia, right? How this land of ours was gradually formed in a political, social, and cultural sense on the basis of this defense needs, right? Something that had been organized from centuries and centuries and was going on and on. And state building based on this warfare. The limited communication routes of the time made it also relatively easier to identify key strategic points, simplifying military geographic assessments. Regardless of all these fortifications, of course, especially a bigger army, because this is in proportion what we're talking about in terms of hierarchical importance, right? If you had an army in the tens of thousands, of course, you couldn't simply ditch yourself into some sort of fringe with no roads, with broken terrain, forest, whatever. You would have starved to death. It would have been impracticable. Water is the first needed, so valleys, and that's where mostly cities are, and that's where in fact, like, roads run along to begin with. So that's also been always something relatively straightforward in terms of the most important centers and essentially what provincial and regional struggles will be fought over. And this is the point. Regardless of such relative ease, establishing a network of fortifications was still a complex task. Because again, it wasn't about just one fort or one single walled city or whatever. It was about creating so many points de vue, necessitating in turn a combination of organizational skill, gradually accumulated resources, political acumen, military knowledge. So all things that everybody had to contribute to. Right, we often talk about the costs of medieval knights. Well, the cost of medieval knights also passes through which communities have to store resources for and where. So this creates a disproportion even in the concentration. Or at least you have to carry resources, concentrate them in different places. The communities must be cooperative. It must comply, and they will likely do this in a general sense because they will produce knights anyway, regardless of how politically concentrated their seigneury is. And so in any case, there will be someone there that will sort of oppose itself and will be able to entrench, and so you must also show these people who's in charge, right, on the basis of how good and persuasive you are in one way or another. The culmination of these efforts led to a robust and lasting defensive framework consisting of numerous castles capable of providing mutual support, strategically positioned along the limited transit routes. A castle could be ignored and bypassed, for example, with only the surrounding areas ravaged. However, this would limit damage to the enemy, and more crucially, the offensive would fail to yield any lasting achievements. If the goal was territorial conquest, the siege was the only valid approach. There could be, as we said before, like single fortresses that would simply be overwhelmed even before attacking them. People would surrender. But let's say if your plan as a, say, provincial force is to go past a provincial castle and that is manned and it's capable of sending harassing parties against your supply lines, well, you can't go on. That's why castles are there for, and so you have to stop and besiege, hopefully storm it. And this would generally proceed like with some degree of speed, even depending on, again, the circumstance. But you had still to stop and to take your time and resources for this, and this could change again so much from a strategical point of view. Thus, the Middle Ages did not select the siege as its primary warfare tactic. Instead, the essential function of fortifications made sieges a necessary element in military campaigns, as always, but in a more pronounced way during this era. For a feudal lord aiming to subdue a rebellious vassal, reaffirm a violated dynastic principle, punish a commune seeking independence, or pursue territorial ambitions, the consistent approach was the challenging and costly path of siege warfare. For example, the victory at the Battle of Hastings on October the 14th, 1066, I made a video just for that anniversary this year, did not by itself secure a kingdom for William the Conqueror, though it was a critical first step. You annihilate basically like the greater strategic force, right, of the able-bodied males of most of England, can like also with their moral capital, not just the motivation, but for example, like all the officers, the commanders that knew how to organize an army like that, and that had done so much even before Hastings in the same year. After this, what you could do, was entrenching, digging in, and so creating this incredibly long resistance that, as you know, brought the harrying of the north. So this extended series of mostly sieges whereby William systematically subdued the Anglo-Danish nobles who opposed him in one of the most ruthlessly and traumatically violent chapters in the entire medieval warfare that went on for years and years. This wasn't even such an encapsulated land, right? This is why, for example, the Normans must have been so happy to finally conquer places like England or Sicily, because these were not places that had witnessed that incrustated, like sort of encapsulation, that metastatic encapsulation that had prevented, say, the Kingdom of France, for example, to simply recompact under a single rule, if not like in hundreds of years of relentless, in fact, mostly siege warfare, if you really look at that, like in the construction of a seigneury that could be above the others, and so hegemonizing the entire system. And regarding, in fact, the relevance even of open field engagements, when even centuries later, for example, during the 100 Years' War, it was not the battles of Crécy, Poitiers, and Azincourt that ultimately determined the course of a campaign or the war itself, but rather these are all English victories, by the way, so that considering the outcome is obvious. But rather the capture of urban centers and castles from the enemy. I made a video about the Battle of Poitiers, by the way, in 1356. I think it's one of the single most beautiful battles that I've ever reconstructed. It has everything. It's definitely the greatest performance of the Black Prince. And that also tells you how sort of complicated the strategic background really was, or at least how challenging moving across like an encapsulated territory could be. So modern military strategies rightly highlight the considerable risks and costs involved in assaulting fortified positions, a principle supported by numerous examples from the 20th century and contemporary warfare. I mean, look at the war in Ukraine. I mean, basically the Russians throw bodies at Ukrainian fortifications, the Ukrainians defend practically every inch. And so you understand how that's basically siege warfare, and to a degree that is objectively shocking to the creators, like even, I don't know, World War the First, because this is essentially trench warfare at the end of the day, like also made multiple videos on the latter specifically, is siege warfare. I mean, how do you define a siege? It's just like one single fortress. We talked about Verdun, we talked about different encounters, which in fact we're really looking at conquering a specific fortified position, if anything. So I will not digress on this more like philosophical concept, but a siege fundamentally is both a challenging military endeavor and an extremely demanding logistical task. Right? An incapable commander will struggle to secure victory in a siege regardless of whether they are defending or attacking, which tells you in fact how challenging really a siege is behind the notion of, okay, well, I will just entrench myself into the castle. Siege warfare was so effective in the Middle Ages because the defenders were very competent. It could have not been otherwise, again, in a culture dominated by these kind of clashes. But sieges, in this sense, are incredibly ruthless iron arm, right? And I plan to make... I still haven't written anything, at least I haven't still published anything, about siege warfare in that technical side of the story. Also, urban warfare could enter this at least as a closed space. There are some, major battles in medieval history were fought within city gates that nobody sort of acknowledges because they say, well, it's just, a city clash, isn't it? It's not. There were enormous battles that you can even see as sieges in many ways, and the sense being, but it still responds the same exact dynamics of siege warfare. It's even more complex than, again, no siege is like another, really, so we shouldn't overly concentrate on objects. Like, for example, the structure of castles is important, yes, but it's, again, the destructive means employed, the level of, say, again, all the strategic quantities involved. How much can this guys last for defense? Like, how many resources are stored? Like, what's going on? Why is this place being besieged? Like, what's happening in the rest of the campaign? These things always modify everything that is strictly material, just per se, right? In any case, it is imperative to reassess certain perceptions about the relatively basic nature of medieval warfare, right? It's incredibly important to get these things right. Again, I'll be at some point publish something very specific about how actual assaults were carried out, how the entire tempo of the operations was set, how important combined arms were. People think that siege warfare was sort of more primitively brutal, and yes, there were things up to very late in time, like throwing rocks from the battlements was sort of quite very effective, but otherwise, the actual employ, for example, of combined arms, synchronizing artillery bombardments with the assaults, etc., was incredibly sophisticated. But I'm talking the central centuries of the Middle Ages, not even, the later ones with explosives, mines, again, it could blow up entire sections of the walls. Like, I'm talking where there was no obvious way to simply break through, right? And also what happened when you entered, right? Because it wasn't over. It wasn't just about taking the walls, right? There could be more rings, as we said before, but there were citadels that normally held out even when, things were apparently done, and they had further resources to resist there for very long. In any case, it was also about taking the square, taking any place that was where most of the resources were concentrated. If we're talking cities, especially, like there's a public palace of sort, and there are all specific means to do so, to achieve, like also surprise, to sneak in, etc. Contrary to common beliefs, thus the Middle Ages represented an era of sophistication, even from a military perspective. Examining siege warfare, the study of sieges, in poliorcetics, the science of conquest, reveals that many long-held assumptions require reconsideration. To begin with, it's essential to highlight that there was, contrary to widespread opinion, continuity, rather than rupture in the military knowledge from the Roman and classical periods. Medieval commanders engaged with Roman texts. These weren't so much like the reason why this continuity existed, but if anything, a symptom They demonstrated, for example, their familiarity with these manuals while adeptly constructing and utilizing ancient siege engines, modifying them to fit contemporary resources. And actually, things like trebuchets were way more, performing and better adjusted for the type of fortifications of the Middle Ages. The truth is that nobody had really ever to teach anyone how to besiege a fortress. It's not because there was a manual that people would simply do it in a essentially more successful way. It was just about divertissement, together with some useful information that could at least awaken the mind to some general conceptualization. But as we've seen, it's not until the late modern era that military manuals start serving like for a real practical purpose in a way you can simply apply those notions in a way that at least supports your still necessary experience, direct experience. But, for example, torsion artillery ropes were primarily made from horsehair during the medieval period, as it was more accessible than the animal tendons used by the ancients. And this requires, of course, some ingenuity and practice and skill. Metallurgical advancements also led to the development of tension-powered machines, resulting in the creation of massive and powerful crossbows equipped with steel bows. Besieging cities was also an important part of the war. Like most sieges revolved around the smaller fortifications, and towns, of course, across Europe could be of different size. But probably the best example of this derives again from Italy, right? After 2 decades of warfare in the peninsula from 1154 to 1176, Emperor Frederick Barbarossa's ambitions faltered, not only due to his defeat at Legnano in open field, right, in 1176, but also because of his unsuccessful sieges of Ancona in 1173 and Alessandria the following year, actions that politically and militarily weakened them, and that together with many other political and military issues across Europe and the Mediterranean, created the balance that would bring to the same Legnano. But besieging a city, especially again one of Roman origin with tens of thousands of inhabitants like the Lombard one, was a massive feat. Like Barbarossa was yet another great organizer, a great knight of his time, and he really put an extraordinary effort that strained the same tolerance, in fact, of his German, other than just his Italian subjects. And that was a monumental effort of a man that are only, say, that there are times that sort of produce men of a certain fabric, of a certain fiber, right, that really can't be sort of easily produced. These are the same years of Richard Lionheart, Philip II, Augustus. Like, we're looking still at a time in which, like, the warfare is really a matter of will, like of single individuals to a degree that wouldn't quite be sort of later. And this siege warfare, like, for example, the destruction of Milan, but the rebuilding of the same city by the Milanese, really shows you there, like, the sheer amount of material resources required for this effort that could have not been led hadn't there been a major interest behind, of course, the domination of Italy in the Mediterranean, reuniting East and West, etc. Moreover, the cinematic depiction of attackers riding swiftly around city walls distorts a bit reality. Combat during a siege primarily occurred on foot, right, and it was often beneficial to keep some horses at a distance due to the logistical challenges they presented. In fact, especially in approaching the city, not much when you managed to enter it, there was like a precaution, mostly due to the potential ambushes set up in the suburbs all around, to send infantry ahead, also in times in which cavalry was decisive. Well, still, this was the only exception in which infantry was sent in first, right? In fact, even knights, despite their armor and training, were not consistently effective during at least the entire duration of a siege. they actually spearheaded the assaults, but they needed the support, of course, of other troops like in open field or even more. And in general, most of the siege was this attrition, this preparatory work, like for sending, in fact, the men-at-arms in eventually when the enemy was sufficiently cooked, let's say, and softened up, worn out, which was, however, very straining for the besiegers as well. So you sent the best, like the elite in only when it's like a reserve on the battlefield, the last line, the strongest one, say that has to dealt the final blow. Once the aggressor had encircled and isolated their objective, they could pursue different methods to successfully conclude the siege. Like there was a normal ether throughout most of the Middle Ages, but the first one was non-military in nature. Like the most practical way to win a stronghold was soliciting betrayal from the within, which is sort of obvious and in fact showing you how even just material issues are not that relevant just per se. Then if the general balance was precarious, you could of course intimidate the defenders by employing psychological tactics of sort, like threatening, like to exterminate anyone, like which would sometimes happen anyway. So you could never really know, but they were pretty twisted. And say in warfare, usually people actually get themselves killed for the right reason, rather than falling for tricks. But there were different ways to sort of trying to avoid the direct confrontation. It could be a bloodbath, right, for the attackers. So you could try, for example, to undermine the fortifications. But at large, it was sort of a very complex thing. Also, like, you can destroy a section of the walls, but it's easy to simply refill its gap. It's not like again, simply by doing that, all of a sudden the advantages of defense crumble, right? You can easily rebuild this, and it's difficult there to simply like destroy it further. Like there is a breach you're going to charge into, and it's going to become. It all depends on how, like, the cost-benefit ratio serves the purpose. You can starve, of course, the populace at some point if you're really able to isolate the enemy. You surrounded, of course, the stronghold and prevented anyone from resupplying it. At some point, this will have to fall, unless you have, more pressing reasons, like just for getting out of there before that, which may be there. In fact, keeping a siege is costly. You can also bombard. You would regularly bombard a stronghold in a way or another. Like even today we talked mostly about the heart of the Middle Ages, but even in times of relative technical shortcomings, there was always some kind of bombardment, or sort of even with very, very simple but effective means. Think about like the muscular traction mangonel. We'll see now some of these means, but you can always bombard someone at the end of the day. There was also no mandatory order, in fact, to these actions. They were happening simultaneously. This selection of a particular strategy was contingent on the commander's insight, available resources, and time constraints. The normal practice was, first of all, like blockading everything and bringing the necessary personnel to pave the way for the siege properly. Skilled carpenters were crucial, for example, for constructing and maintaining siege apparatuses. Some artillery pieces were, for example, the trebuchet beams normally were not built on the spot. The frames were, but these were very highly crafted components that were often stored in some of the public places, well guarded for these occasions. You needed their trained artillery crews. Stone masons who crafted appropriately sized projectiles. You would be surprised by how relatively difficult it was actually to find all this. Even in a time you say, oh well, okay, I will find wood and rocks, but it doesn't quite work like that. You need, first of all, the right types, and then you have to work them to a degree. And there was a lot going on in terms of storing prepared ammo. Like, for example, we know, I don't know, during the Albigensian Crusade, there wasn't much of a progress organization. It was mostly Northern French crusaders. Fighting in the south, there was also much less centralized, and so it was difficult to find even just means to uniformly cope with the enemies, especially during those sieges of this very impervious strongholds of the Cathars. The English of Edward I instead had a very concentrated power. They had accurately and uniformly shaped trebuchet projectiles they would use during, say, the Scottish or the Welsh wars with profit, right? That costs only, tidy and sort of well-orderly powers can afford that. You need miners to dig tunnels beneath fortifications to weaken. And in general, like, the siege would proceed with a general weakening of the fortification, the defenses in general. It was mostly about attempting these assaults that normally happened all around the perimeter, whichever part could be attacked, right? So that this would dilute the defenders across the same, and then hoping that the losses ratio would be fair across the two would be favorable to you, right? And there was a lot of skirmishing throughout the rest of the period among the attacking forces. For example, archers and crossbowmen proved vital. They had to shower defenders with projectiles, essentially suppressing them, while the infantrymen maintained constant vigilance over the camps and besieged areas to thwart enemy sorties and block reinforcements during the assaults. And sieges weren't fought just in this phase. Like infantrymen, for example, were necessary to maintain constant vigilance over the camps and besieged areas to thwart enemy sorties and block reinforcements. So there was a lot. We've seen it often in the video about the siege of Vienna. That also shows how, for example, in that case, the Turks did not really create a circumvallation all around this massive city. And so the Ottomans knew something about siege warfare, and this tells you how prohibitive the costs for the larger settlements really were. It's very interesting. You also needed, of course, to keep this entire system supplied. Foragers played an indispensable role in gathering food, firewood, and other necessities to support the besieging troops. The extended nature of a siege also required a well-organized administrative framework to oversee these critical elements crucial for success, even just in terms of siege machine engineering or the skills needed to operate them. The resourcefulness of medieval individuals in adapting technical knowledge from other domains is evident. For example, the development of the trebuchet was facilitated by advancements in construction machinery, particularly the large winches employed for raising heavy loads to impressive heights during the construction of Gothic cathedrals. So you see, you can't really disjunct an aspect from another. Right? This is the product of a world civilization that is evidently as advanced as it looks. The teams that operated these larger siege engines demonstrated a level of precision and efficiency similar to that of modern artillery crews. So I think a bit more respect towards medieval warfare is really owed for many reasons. So while deep-seated historical and social factors compelled medieval leaders to predominantly adopt siege tactics in warfare, it's equally important to recognize their undeniable expertise in effectively navigating this complex form of combat, both in terms of creating defensive structures and employing strategies to breach them. So let's give a look at this artillery, other siege engines, to appreciate a bit of this technicality, and let's look at some aspect of how you lead. You actually wage a siege. So the mangonel is one of the most famous words, if anything, associated to medieval warfare in general, because of sieges as well. The term describes a unique outcome of the convergence of medieval cultures, originating in China around the 6th century AD. It likely reached the Western world approximately 3 centuries later, facilitated by the Avars, Moors, and Byzantines. Just yesterday I made a video about the Avars, partially explaining that, but we have a lot about Eurasian warfare that you want to check out, especially in the Steppes Warfare playlist. There's also one about the history of cavalry, and again it's easy to find stuff about especially siege warfare. We mostly discuss late medieval guns rather than else, but we're expanding, as you understand. So the mangonel engine functioned as a large slingshot on a movable arm powered by human energy, with the potential to hurl projectiles weighing between 25 and 50 kilograms across distances surpassing 200 meters. Its primary advantage lay in its quick firing capabilities. During the siege of Lisbon, we are in 1147, for example, 2 mangonels unleashed over 5,000 projectiles on the city held by the Muslims within a mere 10 hours. Right, and never underestimate the fire concentration in medieval warfare. You don't want to be under this kind of bombardment or under tens of thousands of quarrels falling in and out. Now, the trebuchet is the peak of medieval artillery. Like the mangonel, it utilized gravity as its propelling force, enhanced by a substantial counterweight. It emerged in Europe around the 12th century. It quickly gained favor for its ability to launch long arcing shots that could clear fortifications and inflict significant damage on buildings. An illustration from approximately 1220 shows a trebuchet with a counterweight of 18 cubic meters, capable essentially of accommodating up to 30 tons. A well-constructed trebuchet of this kind could accurately launch a 100 kilogram projectile over 400 meters, or a 250 kilogram projectile over 160 meters. It's really insane. Naturally, there were just a few of these pieces because they were extremely costly, also tend to break down, but there were many smaller engines that were operating at the same time. And you can't even start sort of easily distinguish from, for example, hand crossbows to a degree. This is the same for firearms when they appear. Right, musket, for example, was originally mobile artillery for siege warfare. You have the springald. This was a large crossbow representing a direct evolution from the Roman ballista and was adept at launching heavy bolts over considerable distances with impressive accuracy. Unlike the mangonel and trebuchet, the springald produced a flatter trajectory, making it more advantageous for defenders. Positioned on battlements, these powerful crossbows could inflict damage on individuals from afar or target siege equipment, particularly with incendiary bolts, all while ensuring the safety of their operators. Then you have the mobile tower. This is also very iconic. It could be armed, but it was mostly just a mean of transportation, essentially. When the terrain was relatively level in front of a fortification, siege towers could be maneuvered close to the walls. These massive constructs were feats of carpentry requiring a robust design to support both men inside and withstand enemy fire. Transport to the base of the walls was managed by draft animals, while the entire structure operated on wooden rollers to facilitate movement. There were also static towers, actually a practice which is not very much represented but was pretty much standard in the peak of medieval siege warfare, was essentially erecting walls and towers of the same size of the besieged strongholds. That is to say, literally like bombarding one another at the same level. And they were big, right? They were something that the authors of the times noticed being, a feat, even surpassing the one of Julius Caesar at Alesia. And they weren't wrong about this. I mean, they were massive feats of engineering. Today we do not talk about field fortifications that are really the quintessential piece here. We shall make a video entirely on that. But they were making this thing more than, for example, mobile towers. You had something like, for example, the so-called cat. I will skip here also the major issue, that is the terminology. Catus, the cat. But they came out in all kinds, and in fact it's difficult to simply categorize them. The most standard definition was machine, because at large it encompassed everything that was used there. So the chroniclers probably are not interested, because it was so normal to see all this different siege equipment in action all together, that it was the whole, the concert of these elements, not a single piece just per se, that again mostly excites our modern secular fantasy. To them it wasn't as important, or at least it was noted as an exception that confirmed the rule, in fact, of a much more comprehensive approach that also for other cultural, social reasons we can't simply digress on, was not really described by the sources of the time, like some aspects, say, of infantry warfare. Many infantrymen, we recently made a video about Erlenwald, for example, showing how also in urban warfare they were deputed not just to fighting, but to some degree of technical skills, because some of these men were craftsmen. They had literally that skill and capacity how to operate these machines, these tools, in a siege situation, like in warfare in general. And they wouldn't simply write about this, but there is a universe underneath this surface of just like the explicit sources that we understand through this various information. The cat was essentially a portable fortress on wheels, featuring a roof designed to be both sturdy and fire resistant. Then you had the battlement ram. The ram was utilized to smash through castle gates and walls, particularly when they were not sufficiently reinforced. It was housed within solid frameworks meant to protect both the weapon and its operators. Estimates suggest that a force between 1 and 2 tons per square centimeters was necessary to fracture the granite blocks typical of a fortress. To achieve such concentrated force, a pointed metal tip was required, weighing at least 700 kilograms, which actually tells you how relatively infrequent actually the use of these specific machineries really was, meaning that aside from the simplest ones, you wouldn't always have, at least in the accounts, like the notable presence of such monster. Like sometimes we have, of course, like the exception. That's also why we know they existed in this bigger fashion, but it wasn't really the norm just per se. So you must be able to understand that the sophistication did not just stem from the pinnacle of this technology, but from the doctrine of employment, as always. In fact, the most documented tool, can you guess what it is to storm an enemy castle? Well, of course, the ladders, right? This is a straightforward method for reaching castle battlements, involving propping a ladder against the wall, allowing assault teams to ascend, while ground-level archers provided cover for the attackers. Sometimes these ladders were narrow, sometimes they were wide. And they were as straightforward as effective at the end of the day. There is nothing about the... of course, you must channel these forces now into this through these means, but this largely depends on how many you have, what's the perimeter you're attacking, like how many defenders, how many attackers, and so this can't be quite always the same thing. To prevent defenders from toppling the ladder, some attackers employed poles for additional support, or secured it against the wall with ropes. More advanced versions of these ladders featured specially designed hooks that could latch onto the battlements effectively. There were other means that now we're simply not going to digress on, but just for saying how much technically you could find in these sieges. As we have observed, organizing a siege was a protracted, expensive, and demanding endeavor. Those initiating the assault need to position themselves beneath the fortifications, build necessary siege engines, gather supplies, uphold troop discipline, and exhibit tremendous patience. On the other hand, those being attacked faced fear, hunger, thirst, and hopelessness. Both sides experienced attempts at desertion and betrayal, with the threat of surprise always a factor. For example, sorties aimed at concentrating like this sometimes were very inferior for normally much numerically inferior forces compared to the enemy, but on the specific section of the enemy line that was well fortified on a regular basis and hosting the production of siege engines as well could bring, in fact, the latter to be an objective from the defenders that would save time by make this sudden attacks that were sometimes successful. Otherwise, they would have not even attempted them. And again, I can thinking about so many episodes that I could simply throw in, but some of you have no idea of the sieges even having happened. But they were so normal. Like, what I would like to stress, if anything, in this kind of bit is that it doesn't happen like once in the Chronicles, and then we make this historiography over it. There is plenty of this stuff, really a lot, and not just notionistically, like in a very systemic fashion, even just from a strictly documentary point of view. So let's look at different factors of this all. Because again, a siege could go different ways, many ways in fact. The deployment is a particularly important moment. Like, once you surround the enemy as a besieging force, you also establish a campsite. So this must be a very relevant moment for everything involved, because you must decide essentially where you have to concentrate forces, how to organize them, to build protective structures, having an idea of more or less how the enemy fortification is in the first place. And so you must have a very good eye. We've seen in that video about Vauban how still, in fact, in the late 17th century, great advancement in siege warfare in many ways, there is first of all still a lot of immobilism. Actually, the 17th century witnesses a lot of that, and we've seen how in the age of Marlborough, like, still pitched battles were really much less than sieges on a regular basis, and so you can't even speak of the Middle Ages as seeing like that as a greater eventuality. Actually, this is even debatable in comparison. So I made a video about the staticization of siege warfare that still, for example, at the time of Montecuccoli seemed a huge deal, and an obstacle in the further development of the art of war. And this because we're not talking just materially determined issues, but essentially the will of sovereigns of states, like just to confer enough resources to their commanders in order to push more strongly. So remember the good enough. Remember this kind of inertia that is framed within the laws of reciprocity between the enemy. Like there isn't in this, especially in the bigger clashes, like one guy that is an idiot and the other was not, right? People make mistakes at some point, but at large, it's incredibly difficult to have like a major disproportion by which it's even complicated to realize what is going on to begin with. So it's all really complicated. It does start with a good deployment of troops. The siege machinery. So as we've seen, towers, trebuchet, mangonels, these also are constructed and strategically positioned because they must hammer the strongholds of the enemy. They have to, or it depends really, like what they have to do. Like maybe they have just to suppress a strong point. Other times they have just to, in fact, destroy one of the weakest sections of the wall. And so this will bring to some countermeasure from the other side, but you can have this initial adjustments accordingly because of the weaker points and stronger points. Then there is a problem of reinforcements and reserves and general supplies, right? The besiegers must ensure that both their troops and animals are well supplied, either through land routes or by sea, targeting coastal cities. And so you must be sure that your entrenchment does not essentially severs you out. If there is especially an enemy that is trying to cut off your supply lines, you must pursue a siege with also some cooperation of forces. For example, ships and land forces, often when besieging coastal cities, must cooperate in ways that are very delicate. We've seen this in some occasion. Then cutting off food supplies, like the besiegers work to deny the enemy access to food by destroying crops and altering water supplies is really crucial. From one side, you may have just someone managing to break into the fortified stronghold. You may not be able to fully encircle it. So at that point, you have other means at your disposal. Poisoning the springs, like doing something like laying waste to the surrounding countryside from the side from which the enemy is supplying himself. It does generally work. Like there's a general capacity to, especially do this preemptively, right? You're going to, for example, besiege a castle. Well, before you do so, you lay waste the surrounding countryside so that the locals that are going to, be faster in bringing the supplies in than you to move your army in, because an army is, felt arriving from a very long distance, especially if you are the lower end receiver of its fury. And so if you send some scouts, some ravagers, whatever, you can lay waste significant amount of local countryside, destroying the seigneurial reserves, this kind of thing. And so the peasants will take refuge into the castle, but there won't be enough supplies compared at least to the ones would have existed if you had not caused this damage initially. In fact, that was really important, especially after, for example, a major battle. So an army is defeated and collapses. So let's assume this is the defenders. In a strategic sense, so the enemy proceeds with the campaign. In that moment, it's typical to see runners running unopposed, riding the terror and the psychological breakdown of the defeated, that is not just the one of the enemy army that is no more, but the one of all those who confided in them, coming to loot up to the very city gates. This is very typical. And so the reason why you want to do that is going as deep as you can, so to pave the way to your army that in this sense is going to find ever less defended places. It will of course need supplies on its own. In fact, at that point hunger would bite as strongly. There's a beautiful letter once read about a nameless guy that was at the head of these raiding parties against an enemy city. He was desperate. He said, we can't go on raiding because we lack food ourselves. Please send us bread. Send us bread, because we want to fight, but we don't have the energies. And this is a physical problem, right? And it's incredibly relevant. Just think of what was happening from the other side. So speaking of resistance, inside the fortified walls, the defenders make arrangements to withstand the siege by conserving their resources, sending out only essential individuals to feed, and turning to prayer as well, which is very important, especially in those moments. You know how critical moments you do pray, but that's also where you can't do too much otherwise. And definitely, regardless of all what can happen in these circumstances, there is, as we've seen, like a hard dimension to this, a hard logic, a hard dynamic that you can't simply bypass, that is entailed by also the close space of siege warfare. Speaking of the assault, as the walls are bombarded with projectiles, the besiegers also would sometimes, not always, it's not too frequent, dig tunnels, so mines, to undermine the fortifications. This was, however, normally like a last resort, because it was such an expensive work that normally it wasn't even tried. Like you would try normally to bombard the enemy battlements and to try the first assaults. And if these failed, so that there wasn't seemingly much you could do but further damage to your own forces through that, which is rare normally, because those who attack, generally speaking, are, at least crushing. If they have started the campaign with their mindset on attacking that stronghold, like the situation is evident there. Normally these places are meant to collapse, right? They do not have just infinite resources, and as we've seen, they don't need to, except in these moments, like especially if nobody is coming to help them, right? But digging tunnels is very difficult, it's very complicated, so it's not something you can even do just every time you want. You must be extremely careful, even with the resources you're spending there, and there's not even like a certainty about the good outcome of this. So even just think about this in a strictly motivational, political sense. Like, is it worth it to stay there? As we'll see in the end now here, there is always a cost-benefit ratio. Like the Schwerpunkt of the campaign also evolves, so you may never know. We've seen movable towers, these wooden towers on wheels, moved close to the walls, and these structures are taller than the fortifications, allowing the besiegers to cross obstacles and ditches. They had means to essentially pour an important amount of soldiers at a time, differently from ladders, which was a bit the problem, because essentially the same walls are thin or narrow, so if you want to overwhelm the enemy, you must pour all these forces that will sort of very physically push like into the defenders, hopefully breaking them with this critical mass pile up inside the tower section. As we were saying, the path must be paved, by the way, like you must fill the ditches, for example, have to tear down any obstacle. This was done also for pitched battles, for example. Notoriously, there were these sappers that cleared the way for heavy cavalry charges, but this is also for the infantry. Like, the sense is that in the Middle Ages, the difference between a host in a city ceases. Both have their towers, like with the pavises and all the actual, stone fortifications, they are similar. They are the emblem of the same kind of power, right? So this all this material side of the story is just like passive to the action of much greater forces. Deception is also relevant, of course. To mislead the attackers, the defenders may showcase grain or well-fed livestock from the walls to create the illusion of having sufficient supplies. But let's not exaggerate. Most of the deception revolved around, this bluff, like how hard are you willing to resist, because they're both giving each other a tough time. Like, it's not just, we've seen there are sorties, and the same besiegers can accelerate or not under pressure, and that's exhausting as well. So it's not just like sitting there and waiting these guys to give up. You have to literally enter the enemy settlement at a point. Like, if it had been just about waiting for the siege to end, there would have not been any other pressure involved. Like, things would have gone very different in general art of war. Here instead, you must, for so many reasons, seasonal, also environmental issues, like when the season is too cold, like you can't protract too much. The army costs a lot politically, even more than materially, and so there is an enormous pressure on getting things done quickly and effectively. Incendiary projectiles. These weren't so common as we normally think, but say the attackers fire arrows and other incendiary devices aimed at creating panic among the defenders, whose structures are primarily wooden. You have the pestilential bombs, barrels filled with waste, along with this sort of biological bombs containing excrement, rotten fish, and decaying bodies are tossed over the fortification. This wasn't also like too frequent, also because if you wanted to take the place, you would at that point risked to get sick yourself, and the Middle Ages weren't something like at every single battle there was a plague breaking out in the countryside. No, right? There were much easier ways to die, from infection to other, bowel diseases. So yes, these things could help that, especially if you manage to pollute water supplies. There were all ways also to, for example, to harass the besiegers as well. For example, it seems that in the aforementioned Barbarossa's campaigns in Italy, that the Byzantines that were siding temporarily with the community, for example, the siege of Ancona, would put some sort of like non-edible ingredients into something like also relatively like you wouldn't like to eat, but I'm typing it to find here the chalk, pieces of chalk into the grain. This they did also, I think, when the Crusaders arrived at Constantinople on multiple occasions, and they were sabotaging them in this way. So this can happen from different directions, right? There were sometimes I've documented things going as far as deviating riverbeds to dry the enemy ditches, and say precluding them to beverage, so to access water supplies. We have all these very complex systems, especially in places with lots of canals and so on. Executions, terroristic means were also employed. For example, killing hostages could taking place in view of the walls intended to intimidate the defenders. There are examples of guys, we've seen it in Italo-German, Polish warfare, but this happened in other occasions too. Like people, including children, like tied to siege towers, so that the defenders would have to shoot on their own offspring from the outset. Terrible things. And never give up, never surrender. Like if you want to make more good, shoot. And that's what happened, in fact. And so you see here the the iron logic behind this all from a military point of view. So this reveals intelligence in an enormous moral force. So that at the end of the day, that's what it gets down to. Like, the siege ultimately ends with one side capitulating, and the besiegers either lift the siege or proceed to raise the captured city. But in general, there could be like some forces simply abandoning the siege and they coming back where they had come from. And of course, when you look at, there are so many dynamics. For example, the more habitual sieges were against better known strongholds, right? If your enemy lives 30 kilometers away, and that's essentially your normal provincial neighbor, right? The general sense is, you know, what's that place like, and so you know certain things that you can't exactly just like put in written record, because they are just gonna be known by those people that are not going, unfortunately, to reveal their secrets or something that they would have not told to a foreigner, and that's quite an issue. Again, talking about medieval siege warfare is never easy because it's never banal. It's never just like a couple of things, right? You have these channels on YouTube showing all the technicalities of how to besiege a stronghold, but that's just a simplification. Even this kind of video is a bit along this pattern, because of course if it is just a basic introduction to that, it's one thing, but I plan to expand, of course, wildly on these topics. You know that I take my time to go very much in depth. So many different stories, examples, anecdotes, and single videos dealing with a different thing at a time. So I want to increase the nature of siege, the content of siege warfare, and really highlighting all the circumstantial reasons why we are really discussing this, even in a general sense of what we can gradually refine. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.